In this section, we'll look at civil liberties during World War I. Of course, as noted earlier, not everyone supported the war, and thus the government had a vested interest in ensuring public support. Wilson, soon after the declaration of war, created the Committee on Public Information with George Creel, a progressive newspaperman from Denver, as its head. Creel first began with a voluntary press censorship that actually worked fairly well. Later, he turned to a massive propaganda effort, mobilizing 150,000 lecturers, writers, artists, actors, and scholars, sort of anybody that was before the public, to tour the country, giving speeches and presentations in support of the war effort. The Creel Commission stressed the nobility of America and the righteousness of its cause, while depicting the Germans as evil, the so-called Hun. The Germans were, depicted as bloodthirsty killers and destroyers of civilization. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. German measles became Liberty Measles. German language and literature were removed from the schools. There was, of course, an ugly downside as a result of all this, with many Americans sort of going after those with German ancestry and heritage. There were actually instances of mob violence. In one instance, a relatively mild case, the Boston Symphony Orchestra dismissed its conductor, a German descendant who had received a decoration from the Kaiser. Even the progressive hero Robert La Follette was burned in effigy because he denounced the violence against German Americans and had voted against the war resolution. Wilson saw himself as a protector of individual freedom of speech and liberties, but he had little tolerance for those who restricted the war effort. It is absurd, he believed, to force people to fight and to give their lives for the country and yet be unable to punish people who obstructed the war effort even without violating laws against treason. In a general sense, one might say it is a fine line between ensuring public support for war and saying you must support that war, or not supporting it is somehow illegal. Civil liberties are always threatened away in most wars. The first significant civil rights legislation was the Espionage Act of June 1917. It provided up to a 20-year prison sentence and a fine for up to $10,000 for willfully filing false reports to help the enemy, inciting a rebellion among the armed forces, or obstructing recruiting or the operation of the draft. Now, while each of these provisions was indeed, in a sense, sort of active espionage or active actions of resistance, the law also empowered the Postmaster General to censor any mail that advocated treason, insurrection, or forcible resistance to American laws. Postmaster Albert Burleson of Texas, however, was not tolerant or discriminating in his judgment, and he quickly went after a broad swath of liberal organizations. He banned most socialist publications simply because of their more collectivist views, even though there was no call for insurrection or violent resistance. In essence, the Espionage Act became a tool to stamp out liberal and radical dissent, but never conservative criticism. One could be prosecuted for advocating just heavier taxation or saying that the draft was wrong or even that the war was contrary to the teachings of Jesus Christ. A movie producer went to jail for making a movie on the American Revolution that showed hostility towards the United States. The most famous prosecution under the Espionage Act was the socialist leader Eugene Debs, a leader in the International Workers Union, the International Workers of the World, who had led some violent strikes against large copper companies, and a candidate for president in 1904, 1908, 1912, the last of which got him 6% of the national vote. Debs spoke out against the draft and the war. He ended up being sentenced to 10 years in prison. In 1920, he received almost 1 million votes for president from behind bars. In 1921, President Warren Harding let Debs go with time served, believing it wrong that he had been sentenced for simply expressing his First Amendment rights for free speech. In time, the Espionage Act went to the Supreme Court. In the case of Schenck versus the United States, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes spoke for a unanimous court in upholding the Espionage Act of 1917. In ordinary times, the court ruled, speech would have been protected under the First Amendment, but at the time the U.S. was actually in a war, and these were not ordinary times. The principle was set. There was in war, at least, a, quote, clear and present danger, unquote, that could limit free speech. Of course, what exactly constituted a clear and present danger for the future remained uncertain. Despite the constitutional objections, the government's power to suppress thoughts and speech inevitably enlarged, not diminished, during the war. The Trading with the Enemies Act of 1917 empowered the president to censor all international communications and gave the Postmaster General some control over all foreign language press in the United States. Because the international workers of the world had staged several violent strikes, and because of fear of radicals and communists, federal agents really cracked down on the Union. Congress passed the Sabotage Act of 1918, which was primarily aimed at the IWW. It made willful sabotage of war materials, utilities, or transportation facilities federal crimes. Because the IWW strikes had been against companies who produced copper, which was needed in the war effort, the IWW was persecuted harshly. For many Americans, its name alone signified communism, which, as will be noted later in this lecture, was brewing then in Russia. Perhaps the most egregious violation of civil liberties during the war was the Sedition Act of 1918. Unlike the Espionage Act's main provisions, which required some act for charges, this law simply made it a federal crime to say anything treasonous. What, of course, was treasonous was debatable. It was applied to any language that brought contempt or disrespect to the United States, its government, its flag, or its armed forces. It was applied for anything stated profane or abusive. In essence, it was clearly a Pandora's box. Many pacifists, for example, were attacked and prosecuted. Speaking of pacifists, Wilson reportedly remarked, "What I'm opposed to is not their feelings, but their stupidity." Anyway, Wilson was by the end of the war, he was getting a bit worried about all the growing hysteria and mob mentality that went along with suppressing dissent. In July 1918, he spoke out in a public statement and even proposed to have the accused tried in military courts to prevent public juries succumbing to the mob mentality. In many ways, nevertheless, he had done as much to set the stage for all these violations of civil liberties himself earlier during the war. This concludes the section on civil liberties during World War I.